So this portion of the segment is on the prominent and formerly enslaved African Americans from Washington County. Elijah has taken the opportunity to highlight specific African Americans who have a really significant history in Washington County. Next slide. So we're going to start off with Frank Trigg, the talented 10th educator and college president. Next slide. We're going to then go to Landon Boyd, Reconstruction government official and juror in the Jefferson Davis trial. Next slide. John Brodie, the American Revolution soldier. Next slide. And Frankie Newton, 20th century avant-garde jazz trumpetist. Next slide. And one of my favorites, Fincastle Sterrett, a businessman and agent for William King, who we'll hear about later. Next slide, please. Thaddeus Harris, who you saw in Professor Jim Hagee's presentation earlier, who was a patron and financier of businesses in the town and owner of what's now the tavern. Next slide. And then we'll hear a video over audio with the writing of Hannah Valentine, a woman enslaved by Governor David Campbell, whose home is located in Abingdon. It's known as Montcalm. Next slide. Okay, so I apologize. I didn't realize the presentation would end there. I'm going to pull up on my screen some information about these folks. I do apologize.
Swan, let's see if the audio works for Elijah now.
Yes, that'd be great.
We are working on it. Thank you for your patience.
Hey folks, I think I'm back. Okay, is that any better? Can you all hear me okay? If so, let us know in the chat.
Much better currently.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much, Juan and Garrett, for trying to fill in there. I really appreciate you, sir. Juan, if we can pull back up that PowerPoint of prominent African Americans in Washington County, I'd like to go through some of those folks and share some of their stories with you. As I was mentioning before, but I don't know if you all could hear me because my audio wasn't the best. What I was saying was, I think Professor Hagee and oftentimes the way that we learn about history in classrooms or textbooks sort of provide us an objective picture of history, but we oftentimes know that those histories are written by those who were in positions of power and influence to be able to write the history. And so what I think it's important to do, and what I'm about to walk you all through, is to tell some of the suppressed histories of formerly enslaved African Americans who, for obvious reasons, weren't able to sort of tell their own stories and have those documented in the history book. So if we can begin with the next slide, please. First, we're going to talk about Frank Trigg, a talented 10th educator and college president. So after being enslaved by Virginia Governor John Floyd, Frank Trigg passed to the ownership of an Abingdon attorney who actually settled the deceased governor's estate. So Mr. Trigg came to be owned by that attorney. While Mr. Trigg was in Abingdon, he actually worked on a farm where he lost his arm in an accident. But despite this injury, he obtained an informal education in his spare time. Trigg returned to the eastern part of the state, closer to Virginia closer to Richmond in 1870, when he enrolled and later graduated from the Hampton Institute, which is down in Hampton, Virginia on the Eastern Shore. And he actually got a chance to befriend Booker T. Washington in the process of that. I actually think that Frank Trigg sort of fits into a prototype of W.E.B. Du Bois's talented 10th model, because Trigg returned to Abingdon to share the education that he gained at Hampton with his fellow African Americans in Abingdon until 1880. He taught at the African American school here in Abingdon called Kings Mountain Academy that many of you may be familiar with. Over his career, Frank Trigg traveled Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina, serving as a college professor at various institutions. In 1916, he settled at Bennett College in North Carolina, Greensboro, North Carolina to be exact, and he became a president of that institution, and he ultimately retired from there. And he's buried in Lynchburg, Virginia with his wife. Next slide, please. Next, we'll discuss Landon Boyd, who actually is my favorite of the folks who we'll be talking about today. He was a Reconstruction government official and a juror selected to try Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy, in his treason trial, a trial that never happened, which we'll talk about a little later. Boyd was born in Washington County in 1838. Research indicates that he was actually the son of his owner, Virginia's Governor Wyndham Robertson, and Charlotte Boyd, the governor's enslaved mistress. And I think you'll see as we sort of go through Boyd's history, he might have picked up some of the political savvy of his father. So Boyd's home was located in Abingdon on A Street Southeast, adjacent to the park and historical marker, which are now dedicated in his honor. It's also close to the fire station, sort of near the entrance of the Creeper Trail. If any of y'all are familiar with downtown Abingdon, Walt and I had an opportunity to go visit that park a couple of days ago, and it's amazing. Boyd was trained actually as an engineer, and he served as a corporal in the Union Army during the Civil War. By 1867, he had moved to Richmond, where he became a noteworthy figure in Reconstruction and sort of the post-Civil War racial reckoning that was going on at that time. While he was in Richmond, like I mentioned, Boyd was actually selected as a juror to serve on the treason trial of ex-president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. This trial actually never took place because President Andrew Johnson issued general pardons and immunity from treason prosecutions to former Confederate leaders. In 1868, Boyd served as an officer in the Freedmen's Bank, which was called the United Lincoln Club. And then he actually went on to serve as the vice president of the Colored National Labor Union in 1870. My favorite aspect of Boyd's life is in that year, 1870, he actually presided as the Grand Marshal of a parade that celebrated the passage of the 15th Amendment that came through Richmond. And I'll say that again. So a former slave who served in the Reconstruction government was able to serve as the leader in a parade that celebrated the passage of the amendment that gave freed Blacks the right to vote. And that parade came through the capital of the former Confederacy. And so this sort of triumph to celebrate African-American voting rights through the capital of the former Confederacy, I think just sort of rings in a sense of poetic justice. Boyd later unsuccessfully ran for the Virginia House of Delegates in 1870, but he did serve on the Richmond City Council in 1872 and later went on to serve as an official in the IRS. Boyd also returned to Abingdon to teach at the King Mountain Academy for African Americans, and he died in 1899. He's actually buried in the African American section of the Sinking Spring Cemetery here in Abingdon. And there is a park that the town of Abingdon has dedicated in his honor called Landon Boyd Park. As I mentioned, that's on A Street. And I would encourage all of you to go ahead and check it out if you're here in Abingdon or if you have an opportunity. Next slide, please. Next, we're going to talk about John Brodie, who is an American Revolutionary War soldier. Brodie fought for American independence as a member of the Over Mountain Men militia, alongside his owner, William Campbell, who's alleged to be his half-brother. He and the Over Mountain Men, which were essentially a group of militia fighters from portions of Appalachia, Southwest Virginia, and other places, he and these Over Mountain Men defeated the British at the Battle of Kings Mountain in South Carolina, which historians actually regard as a turning point in the Southern campaign of the American Revolution. What I think is important to sort of take away about John Brodie is that he, actually enslaved at the time, fought to obtain liberty for a country which denied that same liberty to him. Indeed, Campbell continued to enslave Brodie until his death, so even after his military service. But Campbell's daughter and son-in-law, who inherited Brodie after his original owner passed, set him free, citing in part his instrumental service to secure liberty to his fellow compatriots in the American Revolution. Next slide, please. Next, we'll talk a little bit about Frankie Newton, a 20th century avant-garde jazz trumpetist. Newton is cool for a lot of different reasons. He's very modern, sort of 20th century, Harlem Renaissance, New Negro. He had sort of some very interesting sort of political ideals that I think were a little bit ahead of his time. But anyway, so let's get into him. Frankie Newton, a son of the Blacksburg section of Washington County, was born in 1906. He was an extraordinary jazz trumpetist who had a short temper and radical ideas. He's probably best known for playing jazz trumpet in New York and Boston circuits during the Harlem Renaissance during the 20s and 30s. He actually played on Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit and several songs by Bessie Smith and Maxine Sullivan. Newton rebuffed the segregation and racism that he no doubt encountered in the music industry, even in New England and some of the northern states in the 20s and 30s, and even in the music industry. And he just didn't have any fear for what collateral consequences could happen. He was known to, quote, burn bridges while he was still crossing them, if that gives you a little bit of an idea about his temper or attitude. Newton refused to allow others to subdue his beliefs in racial and economic equality. Newton played in an interracial band, was a member of the Communist Party, and appointed himself bodyguard for his white friend who actually began dating a Black woman. Newton himself actually married a Jewish woman. Walt and I found this out a couple of days ago as we were looking into him. Newton married a Jewish woman whose family originated from Eastern Europe, so he was himself involved in an interracial marriage. Unfortunately, Newton's career was frequently interrupted with bouts of illness, and he died in 1954 from a digestive condition with regard to his intestines. Although it's a little bit hard to sort of define Frankie or put him in a box, I think based on my research of him, he was known to be brilliant, eccentric, articulate, and sort of bohemian, sort of a modern and avant-garde 20th century free-thinking man, somewhere at the intersection between Paul Robeson and James Baldwin, in my opinion. His tombstone simply reads "the greatest," and I think that's a fair statement. Next slide, please. So next we have Fincastle Sterrett. And Garrett, if you are still tuned in with us, I know that Fincastle is one of your favorites. I have some bullet points here, but to the extent that you'd like to jump in and sort of give us an overview of him, feel free. Otherwise, I'm prepared to go forward, but just let me know.
Sure, you go ahead, and if there's anything you'd like me to add, I'll be free to do that.
Will do. So Fincastle Sterrett was born in 1780 as an enslaved person of William King, who, if you're either familiar with Southwest Virginia or just generally history, you might have heard of him. King was an Irish immigrant and one of America's first millionaires who made his fortune in this area of the country by mining salt in Southwest Virginia and later shipping it for sale. Fincastle Sterrett was unusual because William King, his owner, granted him many privileges that were unheard of for slaves at the time, and even rare for free Blacks to be able to do this at the time. Fincastle essentially acted as William King's agent and freely traveled from Baltimore to New Orleans, managing William King's business affairs, negotiating as William King's agent, and even handling large sums of money on William King's behalf. Sterrett also managed William King's affairs at home and likely conducted business with the explorer William Clark of the Lewis and Clark duo, when Clark would come through and stay at William King's properties in Abingdon and Kingsport in the early 1800s. So literally, you sort of have this enslaved person handling the business affairs of this millionaire and interacting with, sort of prominent and famous explorers like Lewis and Clark. I just think that's amazing. After William King's death, Fincastle Sterrett was repurchased and freed by one of King's relatives. Fincastle Sterrett, and I think this is amazing, Walt and I have talked about it, Fincastle actually successfully petitioned the Virginia legislature to be granted full rights as a citizen. And as you recall from Professor Hagee's presentation, even though Fincastle Sterrett might have been a free African-American, that still does not mean that he was able to have the same and equal rights as his white counterparts. So, in something I've never heard of before, Fincastle was actually able to petition Virginia's legislature and be granted full and equal rights of those as his white counterparts. And so after he obtained full citizenship, Fincastle Sterrett became somewhat of a local real estate magnate and businessman in his own right. He wasn't just sort of under the shadows of William King anymore. After he obtained his freedom and full citizenship, Fincastle Sterrett purchased several properties throughout Southwest Virginia. So in 1820, which is a whole 40 years essentially before the Civil War, Fincastle Sterrett was able to purchase, and Walt and I also talked about this, he sort of went around to different tax sales, and which just shows his business savvy, and to the extent, his education, if informal, he would sort of go around to different tax auctions and sort of bid on properties at a low value, and then either flip them or sort of create them and make them profitable businesses. And so in 1820, he purchased 208 East Main Street, which again, if you're familiar with Abingdon or Washington County, and well, let me back up. This building, 208 Main Street, he named it Fincastle's Ordinary, which was somewhat of a tavern where Fincastle would sort of entertain, feed, sort of travelers and local passersby. But if you're familiar with that address, because you happen to live in Abingdon or are familiar with that area, you'd know that it's the current location of a very prominent law firm here in town called Penn Stewart. So again, I just think it's very sort of cool to know and important that, a former slave owned the building where now is housed one of Abingdon's most prominent law firms. Fincastle Sterrett died in 1833, and he attested in his will that his tavern, Fincastle's Ordinary, be sold and the profits used to pay for his son's freedom. So I think that also tells us a little bit about his character, that he was, more of a selfless person. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thaddeus Harris, who Walt and I were talking about a few minutes ago together, is somewhat of a Reconstruction leader here in Abingdon after the Civil War, and became somewhat of a patron and financier. In my opinion, he reminds me a little bit of an Andrew Carnegie or James Vanderbilt, in the sense that he was very sort of interested and engaged in ensuring that the local African Americans had sort of social clubs, businesses, places to go, and I'll sort of jump into his biography. So records actually indicate, records from the 1850s, that Thaddeus Harris was a free African-American living in Abingdon at that time. His profession was listed as a barber, and Thaddeus soon became a successful businessman and patron financier of Abingdon's African-American community. In 1858, he purchased a building that is now known as the Tavern, which I think is one of the more popular buildings here in Abingdon. He used his profits to provide financial support for Abingdon's King Mountains Academy, and which obviously provided an education to African-American students, and co-founded Abingdon's Black Masonic Lodge. The Tavern building stayed in the Harris family for actually over 100 years before it was transferred to new ownership and management. And I think it's actually changed hands a couple of times before it got to be owned and managed by the folks who have it now. We can go to the next slide. I think I might have said Landon Boyd was my favorite, but Hannah Valentine might be a close second. And Juan, if we can cue up the audio that we have prepared to play for Hannah's letter. And I think I also direct messaged you the portions of the clips that we like to play. I think there are 3 portions. So like I said, Hannah Valentine is one of my favorites because she provides a unique sort of perspective into, again, one of those very suppressed histories of women, Black women who were enslaved. So I'll just go ahead and go into it. So Hannah Valentine was enslaved by Virginia's Governor David Campbell and served as a maid to his wife Mary and their niece Virginia at the family's Montcalm mansion in Abingdon. Hannah's letters have been preserved by scholars at Duke University, and as I mentioned before, I think they provide a window into the complex life and oftentimes underrepresented narrative of an enslaved domestic woman, Black woman, of course. I think Hannah was forced to maintain a delicate balance between being a wife, being a mother, managing the house servants, and meeting the demands of her master and mistress, all under the forced conditions of bondage. Hannah and her masters lived under unusually liberal and integrated conditions, which I think are sort of interesting to note that dynamic. They publicly attended church services together, weddings and funerals, and they, meaning Governor Campbell and his enslaved people. The Campbells purchased a literate enslaved woman to teach Hannah's and the others to read and write. The Campbells even allowed their enslaved domestics to host worship services in their basement and often listen to those services through sort of a trap door, and were oftentimes amazed at the singing, dancing, and sort of spirituals that they heard. Although these may seem to sort of be gratuitous pleasantries, and I think, again, sort of unique for the time, I think we have to remember that Hannah was still forced to suffer the usual indignities that are attendant to slavery. And what I mean by that is Hannah's family was actually broken up in 1838 when Governor Campbell was elected as governor and forced Hannah's husband and daughter to follow Governor Campbell to Richmond. Hannah, of course, stayed behind in Abingdon. As I mentioned, her letters provide a first-person account of how she missed the people that sort of meant everything to her, but who were forced to follow the Campbells as chattel slavery. And I just think that's terrible. So Juan, if we can go ahead and play some of those clips, we have a narration of one of her letters from, I believe it's January 30th, 1838, that we'd like to play for you all.
Abingdon, January 30, 1838. My dear husband, I begin to feel so anxious to hear from you and my children, and indeed from all of the family, that I have concluded to write to you, although you have treated me badly in not answering my last letter. I heard through Mr. Gibson last week that you were all well, but hearing from you in that way does not satisfy me. I want a letter to tell me what you are doing and all about yourself and Eliza and David. Mr. Nat Barker sent to let me know that he would set off to Richmond in the stage today, but I could not get my letter ready in time for home this morning. But if he has put it off until the next stage, as I think he probably has, I can still send it by him, or, if he is gone, by mail. Mr. Watson's father, mother, and sister have been staying with him for some time. His father and mother set off this morning for Charlottesville. Miss Ellen, I believe, intends staying with Mrs. Rayleigh until the spring. She has been up to see me several times. Tell Miss Virginia I wish she was here, that she might become acquainted with her. We have had a very sick family. Mr. Latham and all the children had the measles at the same time. They were all very sick for a few weeks, but not all enough to call in a physician. Mr. Latham's father came up and attended to his son's business while he was sick. There is now a great deal of sickness in town and country. The measles are still spreading, and some that have taken cold after having had them are very sick. Our children are very well and are free from the cough which usually succeeds the measles. Tell Eliza her children grow very fast. They do not talk much about her now, but seem to be very well satisfied without her. I begin to feel anxious to see you all. I am afraid my patience will be quite worn out if you do not come back soon. You must write, and tell me when Master talks of returning. And when you write, tell me particularly about Master and Mistress, how they look, and if Mistress is as much pleased with Richmond as at first. Let me hear also how Miss Virginia looks, and if she likes Richmond as well as Abingdon. I have not heard of any of her friends receiving a letter from her. Whenever I see any of them, they make particular inquiries about her, and some of them complain of her not writing to them. Mrs. Watson says she is tired of waiting for a letter from her or Mistress, so she intends writing to them soon. Tell Richard I have not heard from his wife since she left here. She promised to write as soon as she was settled. I do not think that Mrs. Mayo's friends have heard from her, but we think they must be in Mississippi by this time. Tell Miss Virginia her friends are all well. Miss Ellen White has been very sick, but she is now well and has gone to Smythe to stay a short time. Tell David I am much pleased to hear that he has been a good boy. He must continue to be so. And tell him he must send me a message in your next letter. Give my love to Eliza and tell her she must write to me. I want to hear how she gets along without her mammy to help her. Give my best love to Master and Mistress and to Miss Virginia. Give my love to Richard and David, and believe me always your affectionate wife, Hannah Valentine. Please give my love to your brothers and sisters and to their wives and husbands. I forgot to tell you that Mrs. McVicker left a beautiful Bible as a present for you. I have put it away safely for you until you come. Aunt Lathy and Lucy send their love to you all. Hannah Valentine.
Powerful words, very powerful words indeed. And I was just speaking with Walt as that audio clip was being played. And what's interesting, and again, I mentioned sort of the suppressed histories of folks that we haven't gotten a chance to hear from generally or historically. But when you consider, we actually have Hannah's own words, right? So this isn't even historians going back, hundreds of years and trying to create a story or a narrative. This is so rare and so important because we actually have Hannah being able to express her own thoughts in her own words. And as you heard from that clip, she desperately missed her family and children. And as I'm sure many of you know, that's just sort of a very unfortunate and tragic part of chattel slavery, which is families were destroyed, separated, and there was really nothing that she could do to get her family back together other than sort of write them and express her lament. So that was the conclusion of my presentation. I think at this point we are going to bring in Garrett.
I'm here.
Hey, Garrett.
Hey, Elijah.
So I know that was a lot. You are obviously our expert in Washington County history. Did you have anything that you wanted to add about any of the folks that I covered?
You did a great job listing bullet points for all these folks and their prominence in Washington County history. And unfortunately, due to the fact of race, that's really all we know about them. I mean, that's unfortunate to a lot of American and world history, but Washington County has had some individuals, as you pointed out with Frankie Newton, that had an international impact. And Landon Boyd. I mean, it's sad that the Commonwealth of Virginia hasn't commemorated Landon Boyd in his service, especially being the son of a governor. So issues like that, I think, going forward in Virginia, Washington County, I think we need to press these and get the government and other communities to recognize this. I did see a question earlier if we knew who the first slave was in Washington County. To my knowledge, we don't know that person's name. The only recollection of any early slavery in Washington County I have prior to the 1770 will that was cited earlier is Dr. Thomas Walker on his journey through the area in 1748, 49. He himself brought with him slaves from his plantation at Castle Hill in Charlottesville, Albemarle County, Virginia. Those slaves were not mentioned by name, but in his journal, he does mention that he had slaves with him. So that could be the first documented instance of slavery in the boundaries of what's now Washington County today. Fincastle Sterrett, as I mentioned earlier, one of my favorite characters in Washington County history. And unfortunately, you read everything we know about him. But he does have an interesting bio with all he was allowed to do. I personally think that William King may have had a Quaker influence when he lived in Philadelphia. A lot of his money was left to education and not to extravagant wealth. And his home was actually designed potentially after the Free Quaker Society structure in Philadelphia. But so I think that led to Finn as he's often written about having that freedom to travel. And William King obviously trusted him with so much. Unfortunately, we don't know his origins. I would venture to guess he could have been born in Fincastle, Virginia. His age is also up for debate. But Fincastle Sterrett's ability to travel, his ability to own property, and where he owned property in Abingdon was also sort of a half block of minorities and marginalized individuals. A French woman in the 1790s owned a parcel of property there, and then you have Fincastle Sterrett, and then Thad Harris at the tavern later on. So that particular block has a really interesting history with marginalized individuals in Washington County society. Frankie Newton, I love his music. I didn't know a lot about him until I read your work the other day, Elijah. But I knew he was a jazz trumpeter, and I knew he was from this area. Knew he was from the Blacksburg in Washington County, and not in Montgomery County, where Virginia Tech's located. But it was really interesting hearing all that you wrote about him. It'll be interesting to do some more research. You know, him being a 20th century character, we could certainly pull off a lot more history if we dig a little further. There may be stuff in Europe that exists that would be great if we could find that. John Brodie, another one of my favorites. I really love the colonial period, Revolutionary War period. John Brodie really had an interesting service with William Campbell. You know, some legends say that they were half brothers. I think maybe the family has done DNA, and that's been proven to be incorrect. I may be wrong about that. But John Brodie could possibly have been the cause of a political dispute in the early 1800s when William Campbell fought at the Battle of Kings Mountain. John Brodie was left behind with the horses. Campbell gave him his coat and took John Brodie's horse into battle. And so John Sevier and Isaac Shelby, two other colonels in the battle, claimed later on that Campbell did not participate. And others claimed that John Brodie had a striking likeness to William Campbell, and that's where a lot of the kinship comes from. But Brodie's presence potentially caused a smear campaign in the 1800s when Isaac Shelby was running for governor again in Kentucky. So these individuals had an impact on American history, and I'm so glad that we're getting to the point where we can promote this and people are interested in learning about it.
Absolutely. And to one of the later points that you made with regard to the possible relationship between John Brodie and William Campbell, and also what I think needs to be explored more to the extent we can, which is the possible relationship between Fincastle Sterrett and William King, if anything. Something that I'm looking forward to speaking with our keynote speaker, Kenyatta Berry, later on today is how sort of genealogical and DNA research allows us to sort of almost fill in the gaps, right, between what we have down on paper versus what we oftentimes know sort of happened outside the margins of the written word, right, in how African Americans and white people interacted, the relationships that may have occurred that for obvious reasons weren't documented. And so I think projects like these, right, genealogical projects, DNA ancestry projects, are very important in having a more full understanding of sort of our history. Because I personally, when I heard that Fincastle Sterrett was able to have that level of agency and autonomy, it was striking for several reasons. First of all, why would this millionaire, you know, trust an enslaved person with handling his business affairs, absent some sort of pre-existing relationship? Where did Fincastle get his education to be able to go to, you know, have the business savvy to go to these sort of tax auctions and purchase property? How was he able to have such free passage between southern states, between Baltimore, Maryland, New Orleans, Louisiana, without encountering any sort of trouble issues, which I haven't came across in my research of him? What do we know about his complexion, right? Because and not that I've seen, no depictions exist.
Right.
So just like I said, gaps that I sort of hope to fill in going forward, and maybe you all, the historians, will be able to shed more light on.
I agree. With regard to Fincastle Sterrett, you sort of touched on it there. Not just how was he allowed to travel, but how did King expect others to accept him in business dealings? This was an African American, depending upon his complexion, he may not have been as striking of an African American as some may have been, but still there was that stigma. And just how did someone in Baltimore or someone in New Orleans, especially New Orleans, look at an individual who's African American conducting business for someone who has such a striking business reputation as William King did? Absolutely.
Lisa Archer asked a question. Lisa Archer asked a question. Sorry about that. Is that better? Okay. Lisa Archer asked a question. How do you figure out these relationships from what you're seeing in the documentation? I am trying to find a slave's father who is likely the slave owner. The best way of doing that is with the new technology that we have with DNA, and I'm sure Kenyatta will address that in more detail. But with the Washkova family tree that we've put together, there's a good chance that you can find information on where a former slave was enslaved and who the master was. And then it's a matter of finding some of the descendants of the white side of that family and then doing a DNA test. Now, those are not always accurate. They do not always give all the information, partially because we're talking about at least 170 years ago. So there's several generations in most cases back that far. And then some of the tests are rudimentary tests as opposed to the more expensive tests that go into more detail. So if a person does a DNA test with a descendant of a slave owner in hopes of identifying if there's a blood relationship, that's not always going to give you the correct results. But when you do find the correct results, that pretty much answers your question. Most of us know the story about Thomas Jefferson and the Hemings family. And I think that brought to everyone's attention on a national and even an international level that these things can be sorted out with enough attention paid to it, which means, enough expensive testing and testing of as many family members as possible. But yeah, the best way, Ethan West was talking about how he had found some of his slave owner cousins. And then if you just find them to be willing to do so, doing a DNA test and seeing if there is a connection, if it works, it gives you good answers.
It does, and I have a personal experience with that. I love doing my own genealogy, and up until last year, I'd only gotten it back to about the late 1700s on my father's side. My mother's side had taken it back to New England and England. But last year, I had an epiphany. I kept finding where the majority of my ancestors were Quaker, and I never found any census work where there was a slave ownership. And then I found an individual who is a female who had married into a Quaker family, but she had not been Quaker. She had been Anglican, and found that her father had been who would be my, I think, ninth great grandfather, was the governor of the Carolina colony in 1702, James Moore, and he owned a very large plantation and a prominent amount of slaves. And that was very eye-opening for me, and I would have never known that had it not been for Ancestry DNA. And I found it interesting that she left the family, left the wealth, and married a Quaker and moved to the mountains of North Carolina. And so that was very eye-opening with DNA ancestry for me.
Walt, I think we have a follow-up question from Lisa.
Yes, I looked at Lisa's comment and we addressed that. I'm looking at Xanthia Zuber's comments. Why did they put alias and why not put his Edinburgh name on his tombstone? That really depends on who paid for the tombstone. There are sometimes mistakes on headstones, and it really depends on whoever created the headstone, who paid for it, and then they sometimes simply don't want to put all that information. Do we have any more questions regarding this segment? Well, Elijah and Garrett, thank you very much for that presentation. It sure gives a lot of insight into some of the African Americans who lived here prior to emancipation and the successes that they had. You know, sometimes we just have a mental picture that the slaves were just the slaves out in the field chopping cotton or chopping tobacco or pulling cotton. And there's always this story that at least we white people had, that the slaves were illiterate. They just did their job and they were sold if they didn't do their job. That's not really the case. As we see here, there are a lot of African Americans who were in the community at that time who were gifted and talented and had a lot of skills. So yes, that's true.